There are stories remembered because they were shocking. Others are remembered because they were never solved. This story is remembered for a different reason. It is remembered because the investigation failed, not at the end, but at the very beginning. On October 16, 1984, authorities in the Vosges region of eastern France received a report that a 4-year-old boy named Grégory Villemin had disappeared from his family home in L'Éponge-sur-Vologne. His mother, Christine Villemin, had called emergency services around 1750. She was panicked after losing sight of her son, who had been playing in the yard just minutes earlier. Note on time format, France uses the 24-hour clock system. All times in this account are given in that format. 1750 means 5:50 p.m. At first, the situation appeared straightforward. A young child had vanished in a small rural village where most residents knew one another. Search efforts began immediately. They were guided by the assumption that time and coordination would matter most. Local gendarmes mobilized. In France, the gendarmerie is a national police force with military status responsible for rural areas and small towns. Neighbors joined the search. Christine drove through the village streets, stopping to ask if anyone had seen her son. But when the search reached the banks of the Vologne River that evening, investigators were confronted with a reality that did not align with initial expectations. At 21:15, the body of Grégory Villemin was discovered in the cold waters of the river at Docelles, 7 kilometers, about 4 miles downstream from his home. The child's hands, feet, and neck were bound with cord. A wool cap, striped blue and white, was pulled down over his face. He wore a blue anorak and dark green corduroy pants, the same clothes he had been wearing when he went outside to play. What they found suggested not confusion or accident, but deliberation. And from that moment on, the case ceased to behave like an ordinary investigation. What investigators would later come to understand was that the crime itself was only the beginning. The true damage occurred afterward, in the days, months, and years that followed, as the investigation fractured under the weight of media scrutiny, internal rivalries, procedural errors, and premature conclusions that could never be fully undone. At the center of the case was the Villemin family, Jean-Marie and Christine, both in their mid-20s, and their only child, Gregory, born on August 24, 1980. They lived in a newly built house on the heights of L'Éponge-sur-Vologne, a modest industrial town in the Vosges department of eastern France. Jean-Marie worked as a foreman at Auto Coussin Industry, a factory that manufactured automobile seats. Christine worked as a seamstress at a local garment manufacturer. Friends and neighbors described them as reserved, private, and focused on work and routine. They were young, working class, and newly upwardly mobile, a fact that would later matter more than anyone initially realized. In January 1983, Jean-Marie had been promoted to foreman, a position he had earned through merit after refusing to rejoin the CGT union despite pressure from colleagues. The promotion came with better pay. The couple had recently taken out loans to build their house and purchase new furniture, including a leather sofa valued at 25,000 francs, acquired just 8 days before Gregory's death. But for several years before Gregory's disappearance, there had been a persistent disturbance in their lives. Anonymous letters, phone calls, silence on the line, threats. The harassment had begun in March 1983, shortly after the Villemins' phone line was installed. At first, the calls were silent. Then they became verbal, crude insults, veiled threats, references to intimate details of family life that only someone close could have known. The caller's voice was described as raspy. The family referred to him simply as Le Gars, the guy. The calls weren't limited to Jean-Marie and Christine. Jean-Marie's parents, Albert and Monique Villemin, received similar harassment. So did other family members. Someone was watching them closely. In March 1983, the Villemin grandparents filed a complaint. An investigation was opened, but it was closed in May 1984 with no conclusive findings. Then came the letters. The first arrived on September 22, 1984, slipped between the shutters of Jean-Marie and Christine's home. Written in capital letters, it contained 2 spelling errors. The letter read, "Je vous ferai votre peau à la famille Villemin." A second letter followed on October 5th. Then a third on October 12th, this time written in cursive rather than block letters, with a more personal tone. The letter read, "This is my last letter. You will have no more news from me. You will wonder who I was, but you will never find out. The harassment had an identifiable pattern, but no clear perpetrator. The family had their suspicions, certain relatives, workplace rivals, but nothing concrete. Jean-Marie even tried calling people he suspected in the middle of the night, hoping to recognize a voice. The authorities were aware of the communications, but they were treated as a background nuisance rather than an urgent warning. This assumption, that the harassment was peripheral, shaped everything that followed. When Grégory disappeared, attention immediately returned to these earlier messages. But by then, they were no longer simply clues. They were narratives, and narratives are difficult to contain once they escape the file. On the afternoon of October 16, 1984, Grégory Villemin followed her usual routine. She left work around 16:55 and picked up Grégory from his childminder, Christine Jacot, who lived nearby in the HLM housing complex at Guy Champ. Mother and son arrived home shortly after 17. According to Christine's account, Grégory wanted to stay outside and play on the pile of excavation gravel in front of the house. She put a wool cap on his head because of the cold, then went inside to do some ironing. She turned the radio on at high volume. She liked to listen to a popular comedy program called Les Grosses Têtes while she worked. The shutters were closed as Jean-Marie habitually shut them each morning before leaving for work, worried about burglars. Sometime after 17:20, Christine went outside to call Grégory in. He didn't answer. She looked around the property, no sign of him. Panic set in quickly. She ran to her car and drove through the village, stopping at the childminder's house, asking neighbors if they'd seen her son. No one had. At 17:50, the gendarmerie was alerted. Search efforts began immediately, but even as gendarmes and villagers fanned out across Leponge, something else was happening, something that would only become clear later. Between 17:15 and 7:30, someone had posted a letter at the post office in Leponge. The postmark would show it was mailed at 17:15. The letter would arrive the next day at the home of Jean-Marie's parents, Albert and Monique Villemin. The letter read, "I hope you die of sorrow, boss. Your money won't bring your son back. That's my revenge, you poor fool." Around 1727 or 1732, accounts vary, Michel Villemin, Jean-Marie's older brother, received a phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar. The same raspy voice that had been tormenting the family for months. The caller said, "I'm calling you because they're not answering at the house. I got my revenge on the boss. I kidnapped his son. I strangled him and threw him in the Vologne. His mother is looking for him, but she won't find him. My revenge is complete." Michel immediately called his family. By early evening, search parties were concentrating their efforts along the Vologne River. At 21:15, firefighters pulled Grégory's body from the water at Docelles. The investigation officially began that night. But in truth, it had already been compromised by the anonymous caller who claimed credit, by the letter that reframed the crime as an act of revenge, by the immediate media attention that would transform a local tragedy into a national obsession. The case was no longer being investigated quietly. It was being watched and shaped in real time. Within days, the case drew intense national attention. The photograph taken at the scene, a fireman in a rope harness cradling Grégory's small body, the child's face obscured by the wool cap, appeared in newspapers across France. The image was haunting, immediate, visceral. It galvanized public emotion in a way that would prove impossible to reverse. Details that would normally remain internal began circulating openly. Family disputes, private correspondence, investigative hypotheses. Journalists descended on Leponges, first regional reporters, then national outlets, then international media. Television crews set up camp. The funeral, held on October 20th, drew 700 mourners and was disrupted by photographers and reporters who were pelted with stones by angry attendees. Grégory Villemin, overcome with grief, collapsed and had to be evacuated from the cemetery. The case quickly took on the character of a serialized drama. Media outlets competed for scoops. Leaks from the investigation became routine. The line between journalism and investigation blurred, and the anonymous writer, soon referred to publicly as Le Corbeau, or the Crow, in reference to Henri-Georges Clouzot's 1943 film about poison pen letters, continued sending messages. The Corbeau was no longer a shadow figure harassing one family. He had become a character in a public narrative. His letters were analyzed on television. His voice was discussed in cafes. Theories about his identity proliferated. The case was being solved not by investigators in private rooms, but by the French public in real time through the distorting lens of media coverage. Instead of narrowing the investigation, the communications widened it uncontrollably. On October 17th, examining magistrate Jean-Michel Lambert, a 32-year-old judge based in Épinal, was assigned to the case. In France, an examining magistrate, or juge d'instruction, is a judicial officer who conducts investigations in serious criminal cases. It was his 180th judicial investigation of the year out of 229 total. The autopsy was performed that same day. It revealed no signs of violence on Gregory's body. No bruises, no scratches, no defensive wounds. His clothes were clean. The cords binding his hands and feet had left no abrasions. His mouth and nostrils were partially covered with foam. His lips were cyanotic, and his lungs showed signs of asphyxiation. But they contained only a small amount of water, and there was no way to confirm it came from the Valognes. The conclusion: death by drowning. Possibly in the river, possibly elsewhere. The child could have been drowned in a bathtub before being thrown into the Valognes. He could have been tied up before death, or after. The autopsy could not say. Critically, the examination was incomplete. Visceral organs were not removed for toxicology testing. This meant it was impossible to determine if Gregory had been drugged. Later, an empty insulin syringe would be found near the riverbank at Docelles, Winchertens, raising questions that could never be answered. On October 29th, a handwriting expert, retired Colonel Antoine Argude, was brought in to analyze the anonymous letters. He identified Roger Jacquel, father-in-law of Jean-Marie's half-brother Jackie, as a possible author. But Jacquel was quickly ruled out. He had an alibi for the time of the crime. On November 5th, the investigation took a decisive turn. Bernard Laroche, a 29-year-old factory foreman and Jean-Marie's cousin, was arrested and placed in custody. The decision was based on preliminary handwriting analysis suggesting he might be the Crow, and on the testimony of a 15-year-old girl named Muriel Boll. Muriel was Bernard's sister-in-law. She had been living with Bernard and his wife, Marie-Ange, at their home in Aumancy. When questioned by gendarmes, she initially confirmed Bernard's alibi. She said she had seen him at their Aunt Louisette's house around 1720 on October 16th, the estimated time of Gregory's abduction. But under further questioning, Muriel changed her story. On November 5th, she told gendarmes that Bernard had picked her up from school that afternoon and driven her to L'Éponge in his Peugeot 305. She said they stopped in front of the Villemin house, where a young boy, whom she identified as Gregory, got into the car. She said Bernard then drove to Docelles, where he got out with Gregory and returned alone a short time later. The next morning, November 6th, Muriel repeated her account before Judge Lambert. Bernard Laroche was formally indicted for murder. He was arrested at his workplace, and the arrest was broadcast live on television. From that moment on, every new piece of information was interpreted through a fixed lens. Evidence that did not fit was minimized. Evidence that appeared to confirm the narrative was amplified. But within 24 hours, Muriel retracted her testimony. On November 7th, she told Judge Lambert that the gendarmes had pressured her. She said they had threatened her with juvenile detention and accused her of having slept with Bernard. She said she had been scared and said what they wanted to hear. Then, on November 8th, her family invited journalists to their home. In front of cameras, Muriel said, "My brother-in-law is innocent. It was a trap, and I fell into it. I was in the bus at 5 o'clock. I was afraid of the gendarmes. Bernard is innocent." The gendarmes denied any coercion. They pointed to inconsistencies in her original alibi. She had described the wrong bus driver. Classmates said they hadn't seen her on the bus that day. Her description of when she arrived at her aunt's house conflicted with Bernard's, but the damage was done. The case against Bernard Laroche rested almost entirely on a teenage girl's testimony, and that testimony was now in dispute. At the same time, internal divisions emerged between investigators, magistrates, and law enforcement bodies. The gendarmerie believed Bernard was guilty. The SRPJ, the regional judicial police, had doubts. Judge Lambert vacillated. The investigation fractured, not visibly, but structurally. Once that happened, there was no clear path back. On February 15, 1985, Less than 4 months after Gregory's death, Judge Lambert ordered Bernard Laroche's release. The prosecutor had recommended continued detention, but Lambert disagreed. Bernard returned to work. But Jean-Marie Villemin, who had publicly vowed to kill his cousin if he was freed, was waiting. On March 29, 1985, Jean-Marie confronted Bernard in the garage of Bernard's home in Aumontsey. Bernard's wife and young son were present. Jean-Marie raised a shotgun and fired a single shot into Bernard's chest. Bernard Laroche died instantly. Years later, it would become clear that the inquiry had crossed an invisible boundary. Rather than testing hypotheses, it began defending them. Rather than isolating the anonymous communications, it responded to them. The Corbeau was no longer simply taunting authorities, he was influencing their direction. And crucially, the system never established a clean separation between evidence, pressure, and interpretation. The murder of Bernard Laroche ensured that one version of events, the version in which he was guilty, could never be fully examined, and another version, in which he was innocent, could never be fully disproven. What followed was not resolution, but accumulation. Arrests without closure. Reversals without clarity. Judicial actions that deepened uncertainty rather than resolved it. On July 5, 1985, 3 months after Bernard's death, Christine Villemin was indicted for the murder of her son. The basis for the indictment was a new handwriting analysis suggesting she might be the author of the anonymous letters. There was also testimony from co-workers who said they saw her at the post office around the time the revendication letter was mailed. And the fact that cords similar to those used to bind Gregory were found in the family's basement. No clear motive was ever established. No material evidence linked her to the crime scene at Docelles. The timeline required for her to have committed the crime was extraordinarily tight. She would have had to drive 12 kilometers on rural roads, kill her son, bind his body, throw him in the river, and return home, all in less than 20 minutes. And yet on July 5th, Judge Lambert placed her in provisional detention. Christine and Jean-Marie began a hunger strike. 11 days later, the Court of Appeal in Nancy ordered her release, citing insufficient grounds for detention, but the indictment stood. On July 23, 1987, the Court of Appeal ruled that Christine should stand trial before a criminal court. The decision listed 25 charges against her, most of them circumstantial. The possibility that she had enough time to commit the crime. Disputed witness testimony. Similarities between her handwriting and the letters. Patterns in her phone usage. For 2 years, Christine Villemin lived under the threat of trial, publicly branded as a suspect in her own son's murder. Then, on July 28, 1989, the Court of Cassation annulled the ruling. It found that Judge Lambert had committed numerous procedural violations during his investigation. Hundreds of pages of evidence were struck from the case file. The case was transferred to the Court of Appeal in Dijon for a supplemental investigation. That investigation would last 4 more years. On February 3, 1993, Christine Villemin was granted a dismissal, not for insufficient evidence, but for absence of charges. The court stated clearly there was no evidence against her. In the same ruling, the court noted that very serious charges remained against Bernard Laroche for the abduction of Gregory, but it added that it was impossible to affirm that he had killed the child. Each new phase of the investigation inherited the errors of the previous one. Evidence became contaminated not by tampering, but by context. The crucial revendication letter, the letter mailed on October 16 claiming responsibility for Gregory's death, was damaged during forensic testing. Black powder used to search for fingerprints rendered it unusable for later DNA analysis. The letter was temporarily lost entirely. It was recovered only when a copy was found in a misplaced report. A faint impression of the initials LB was discovered on the letter, matching Bernard Laroche's signature, but the evidence could not be used because of how the document had been handled. Handwriting analyses produced conflicting results. Some experts said Bernard was the author, others said Christine was. Still others said Roger Jaquel or members of the extended family. Even when new forensic methods emerged years later, DNA analysis in 2000, more sensitive testing in 2008, they were applied to a case that had already lost coherence. In 2000, DNA extracted from a stamp on one of the letters proved unusable. Too many people had handled it. Too much time had passed. In 2008, new DNA analysis found traces of two individuals, a man and woman, on a letter mailed 9 months after the crime, but the samples were too degraded to produce identifiable profiles. The investigation reopened. It closed. It reopened again. In 2017, 33 years after Gregory's death, 3 members of the extended Villemin-Jacob family were placed under formal investigation: Marcel and Jacqueline Jacob and Muriel Boll. The theory: that the crime had been committed by a family cell, with Bernard as the executor, but others as accomplices or instigators. But in 2020, Muriel's pretrial detention was annulled by a court that found her original 1984 interrogation had been unlawfully conducted. By 2025, no charges had been filed. No trial had been held. No resolution had been reached. In later reviews of the case, one conclusion appeared repeatedly. Not as an accusation, but as an observation. The investigation had never reset. At no point was the inquiry allowed to return to a neutral baseline, free from early assumptions, media exposure, or internal rivalry. On October 16, 1984, gendarmes responded to a missing child report. By October 17, they were investigating a revenge killing committed by an anonymous letter writer. By November 6, they had indicted a suspect based on a teenager's testimony. By November 8, that testimony was in dispute, but the narrative remained. When Bernard Laroche was killed in March 1985, the case split into 2 incompatible stories. One in which Bernard was guilty, and Jean-Marie was a grieving father driven to vengeance. Another in which Bernard was innocent, and Jean-Marie was a murderer. When Christine was indicted in July 1985, a third story emerged: the mother who killed her own child, for reasons no one could explain. By the time Christine was exonerated in 1993, the original investigation had been so thoroughly compromised that starting over was no longer possible. The failure was not the absence of effort or intelligence. Dozens of investigators worked the case. Hundreds of witnesses were questioned. Thousands of hours were spent reviewing evidence. It was the absence of containment. The investigation was contaminated from the beginning by media interference, by premature disclosure of evidence, by rivalries between police and gendarmes, by a young judge who was overwhelmed and made critical errors, by a public that demanded answers before the questions had been properly asked. The Corbeau played a role, certainly, but so did everyone else. Judge Jean-Michel Lambert, who granted interviews to journalists and disclosed details that should have remained sealed. Lawyers who leaked information to gain advantage. Journalists who treated the case as entertainment. Police and gendarmes who competed rather than collaborated. A prosecutor's office that failed to supervise. A media environment that rewarded sensationalism over accuracy. The writer Marguerite Duras published an essay in Libération titled Sublime, Forcément Sublime, Christine Veuf. It was a piece of purple prose that declared Christine both guilty and sublime in her guilt, based on nothing but Duras's literary intuition. The essay became infamous. A symbol of how thoroughly the case had escaped the courtroom and entered the realm of public imagination. The photograph of Gregory's body, published immediately, ensured that the case could never be forgotten, but it also ensured that every development would be viewed through the lens of that image. The anonymous calls and letters made the crime feel like a mystery novel, with clues and suspects and a villain who taunted investigators. The media embraced that framing. So did the public. So eventually did the investigators themselves. By the time the errors were recognized, it was too late to correct them. In 2017, Jean-Michel Lambert, the first examining magistrate, died by suicide at age 65. He had spent 30 years defending his handling of the case, and 30 years being blamed for its failure. In interviews, he insisted he had done his best under extraordinary circumstances. He was not wrong, but neither was he blameless. The case of Grégory Villemin remains unresolved, not because it lacks evidence, but because it was overwhelmed by it. Too many voices, too many interpretations, too little silence. Over 40 years, the file grew to tens of thousands of pages. Hundreds of people were questioned. Dozens were placed under formal investigation. DNA evidence was collected, analyzed, reanalyzed. But the fundamental question, who killed Grégory Villemin and why, remains unanswered. There are theories. Bernard Laroche, acting alone or with accomplices, killed the child out of jealousy toward his more successful cousin. The evidence: Muriel Bowles' initial testimony, witness accounts of a man and a red-haired woman near the Villemin house at the time of the abduction, the handwriting analyses that pointed to Bernard, the investigative conclusion in 2017 that Bernard had certainly abducted Grégory. But Bernard is dead, and the evidence against him was never tested in court. Or a broader family conspiracy, with Bernard as the executor but others as instigators. Marcel and Jacqueline Jacob, perhaps, acting out long-standing resentments. The evidence, the family cell theory advanced by investigators in 2017, the placement of the Jacobs under formal investigation. But no trial has occurred, and the theory remains speculative. Or an unknown actor, someone outside the immediate circle, who has never been identified. Or a tragic accident, misinterpreted from the start. We do not know. What we do know is this: a 4-year-old child was taken from his home, bound with cord, and drowned. The crime was deliberate. The motive remains obscure. The investigation that followed was marked by errors, rivalries, leaks, and premature judgments. Evidence was mishandled. Witnesses were pressured or ignored. The media interfered. The legal system failed, not through malice, but through a series of choices that, in aggregate, made resolution impossible. One man was killed in an act of revenge that may have been unwarranted. One woman was publicly accused and then exonerated, her reputation destroyed. One judge was blamed for failures that were systemic, not individual. One family, the Villemins, the Laroche, the Jacobs, was torn apart. And through it all, the Corbeau's letters remain, crude, threatening, taunting, written in block letters and cursive. Mailed from Leponges, from nearby villages, from unknown locations. Some have been attributed to specific authors. Others have not. In 2023, DNA analysis identified the author of one letter, a woman from Guadeloupe, living in Paris, with no connection to the family or the case. She admitted to writing it on a whim, following the news coverage. A stranger, inserting herself into a tragedy. The case stands as a reminder that some investigations do not fail at the end. They fail at the beginning. And once that happens, no amount of certainty can repair what was lost. In 2008, Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin had Grégory's body exhumed and cremated. They kept half the ashes. The other half were scattered in a place known only to them. They live quietly now in a town far from the Vosges. They do not give interviews. They do not appear on television. They speak only through their lawyers when the case resurfaces in the news. They had 3 more children after Grégory: Julien in 1985, Emmeline in 1990, Simon in 1998. Those children grew up in the shadow of a brother they never knew, a case that defined their parents' lives. The Villemin house in Leponges still stands, though the family left years ago. The Vallon flows as it always has, and somewhere, in a courtroom in Dijon, in an evidence locker in Epinal, in the memories of those who lived through it, the case of Le Petit Grégory endures. Unresolved, unresolvable. That is the story of Le Petit Grégory. If you're interested in carefully researched cases like this one, you can subscribe to the channel. New investigations are released regularly. If you have thoughts about this case or details that stood out to you, feel free to leave a comment below.